What up, YouTube? Here with a post-fight video of the David Benavidez versus Oleksandr Gvozdyk fight. Now, before I give y'all the summary of what happened in the fight, I'm going to tell y'all the results first. David Benavidez cruised to a unanimous decision win in his debut fight at light heavyweight, and now is the interim WBC light heavyweight champion, which has David Benavidez next in line to challenge for the WBC light heavyweight title, and that title is currently held by undefeated fighter Arthur Benavidez, and Arthur Benavidez has a 100% knockout ratio. He is scheduled to have a undisputed title fight versus Dimitri Bivol sometime in the future, and he is one of the best top 10 pound-for-pound fighters in the world right now. And David Benavidez, who is also undefeated, former world champion himself, WBO super middleweight champion, or I believe he was either the WBO or WBC light heavyweight champion when he was champion before he had to vacate it, and he's been on his road to redemption to get that title back, which he never lost. And David Benavidez, he's been on a momentous streak, and you look at his last two fights before this fight versus Gvozdyk, he was able to defeat former two-divisional world champion Demetrius Andrade. He was able to stop Andrade, and he defeated former champion Caleb Plant in a dominant unanimous decision win. And the only fight I can truly say that is next for David Benavidez is that undisputed title fight versus Canelo Alvarez. And David Benavidez is the most marketable name besides Canelo at super middleweight, and is the most well-reckoned name after Canelo Alvarez. And Canelo Alvarez, prior to his fight versus Jamie Munguia was just as notable as David Benavidez was because of his undefeated streak and the momentum that he had and the experience that he had and the victories that he was accumulating prior to fighting Canelo Alvarez for the undisputed super middleweight titles in his last bout. And David Benavidez was the more ideal candidate to challenge for that title. I say that because you look at the list of guys that Benavidez fought and compare to who Munguia fought, Benavidez has the more impressive resume. Hence why there was a lot of people that had thought that Canelo Alvarez chose the less ideal opponent in Jamie Munguia rather than facing David Benavidez. And promotionally speaking, it would have made more sense for that fight between Benavidez to Canelo to happen instead of what we saw 2 months ago when Canelo defended his undisputed super middleweight titles versus Jamie Munguia. Now, that wasn't a bad opponent because Munguia had the right resume to step in there to challenge for the undisputed super middleweight titles. But Benavidez has been collecting more impressive victories versus more higher quality fighters. And Benavidez, he fought a brilliant fight in this fight. And I personally at this fight scored 9 rounds to 3 in favor of David Benavidez, and I only gave round 8, 9, and 12 to Gvozdyk, and Gvozdyk was able to find some success when Benavidez will be on retreat mode. And Benavidez, how he fought this fight, he looked like as if he was in a sparring session. And Benavidez, he was trying out different styles, different rhythms. It looked more like Benavidez stepping in there to gain experience and stay active, and was experimenting with Gvozdyk rather than it being more of a serious fight, even though it was on paper a serious fight because it was for a interim title by a major sanctioning body, and it was Benavidez' first fight at a new weight class. And Benavidez, he looked more slower and sluggish than he usually does, and that's probably due to the fact that he put on more pounds than he's used to when it comes to fight shape. And that could have been a factor as to why Benavidez didn't look as impressive. And Benavidez did say prior to this fight, leading up to it, that during his training camp, he was working on his defense, and that focus was displayed throughout this fight, especially during the last round and round 8 and 9, where Benavidez looked as if he was on retreat mode to see where his defensive ability was at. And Benavidez, his defense was, I want to say top notch, but it showed a good display. And Benavidez, he showed good qualities of it, good skills of it, but it wasn't. It almost looked like when Ryan Garcia adapted that Philly shell style, and he didn't look as natural and as experienced as a typical defensive style fighter, as was the case for David Benavidez, because Gvozdyk was able to find a mark here and there, and Benavidez, unlike Gvozdyk, throughout the entirety of the fight, he was able to find his target, and it was target practice for Benavidez. And Gvozdyk didn't have an answer for Benavidez' game plan, which he fought very well throughout the entirety of the fight. His flow was consistent. His rhythm was consistent throughout the entirety of the fight. It even gave him room to try out different styles. At one point in the fight, he would switch stance from orthodox to southpaw, and throughout the entirety of the fight, Benavidez would have defensive modes where he would go in retreat mode and work off his back foot, even trapping himself against the ropes to see where his upper body and head movement is at, and to let Gvozdyk throw what Gvozdyk wanted to throw at him, and Benavidez trying out his defense and seeing where it's at. And he was able to show improvements as far as a side which most fans hasn't seen from Benavidez, because Benavidez has earned himself a reputation of being a monster, and that's Benavidez and his onslaught and his power and his ability to finish his opponents. And Benavidez in this fight was less aggressive and was less offensive minded, hence why I went the distance, a whole 12 rounds. And Benavidez' performance, we've seen better from him before, but I can honestly say that Benavidez was venturing out because of the lack of options for his opponents, because obviously the ideal opponent for Benavidez to fight next would be Canelo Alvarez for the undisputed super middleweight titles. And he wanted a new challenge that would be worth a while, and that's him stepping up to a new weight class at a heavier weight class. And Benavidez didn't have trouble making weight at that weight class because Benavidez is naturally a big guy. And Benavidez, is he ready for a title shot at light heavyweight? No. I think his focus is that fight versus Canelo Alvarez. That's more of a priority on Benavidez' side than him stepping into a new weight class at light heavyweight and challenging either Bivol or Beterbiev for the light heavyweight titles. And we saw Canelo Alvarez become champion at light heavyweight and he's had 2 fights at light heavyweight. One versus Sergey Kovalev, where he was successful, and he was able to capture the WBC light heavyweight title when he knocked out Kovalev. And he had a fight where he got defeated versus Dmitry Bivol when he stepped up for the second time to become 2-time light heavyweight champion in a decision loss versus Dmitry Bivol. And David Benavidez, I say he needs to get more in shape, and he has to fully focus on stepping up to light heavyweight and fighting a full time in order for him to become a legitimate light heavyweight contender, which he already is, because he has a title that makes him that being the WBC interim light heavyweight champion, and that is held by David Benavidez. And he'll need more fights, and he'll need to have his attention on fighting at light heavyweight rather than him attempting to capture back a title at super middleweight, which he never lost because he's undefeated. And in the midst of that, he could capture all the titles at super middleweight and dethrone Canelo Alvarez to become king at super middleweight. And that's a very likely possibility in the future for David Benavidez if he's able to get a fight versus Canelo Alvarez. And Canelo Alvarez, we do know that he is scheduled to fight this fall, and hopefully it's that fight that majority of the fans want to see, and that's a fight versus David Benavidez. And this wasn't as impressive as Benavidez's victory over on Plant and Andrade. And as I said, that was better performances compared to his victory over on Gvozdyk. And as far as how the super middleweight division is looking right now, other than Benavidez, the top contender at super middleweight is David Morrell, who's the current interim WBA super middleweight champion. He is a unbeaten Cuban fighter. And then there is Christian Ambili, who is the #1 ranked WBC super middleweight contender, because the interim WBC super middleweight title is held by David Benavidez. And then there's also Edgar Berlanga. And then there is, of course, Demetrius Andrade. And then there is Jamie Munguia, Caleb Plant, Jamal Charlo, who had recently got out from being inactive and stepped up to super middleweight. And Charlo, Andrade, and Plant are notable fighters that have a reputation, hence why Jamal Charlo, for instance, with how his situation is looking right now and where he ranks at super middleweight, Charlo has only fought at middleweight prior to him fighting at super middleweight, and this is a relatively a new division for Charlo to compete at. And it's because of his accomplishments at middleweight that's what makes Jamal Charlo a notable name at super middleweight, and he has credibility because of his accomplishments at middleweight. So when he steps up to super middleweight, that makes him a marketable name for any of these top fighters at super middleweight to get in there with the likes of Jamal Charlo. And David Benavidez, how he currently ranks at light heavyweight, even though he's an interim champion, I don't think he should be considered a top 10 contender at light heavyweight and a legitimate contender at light heavyweight to challenge for any of the titles at light heavyweight. He'll need to, as I said, rearrange his focus to competing at light heavyweight full time. And Benavidez, he possesses the skills, the power to be considered a top name at light heavyweight because of his abilities. And David Benavidez, if he does decide to fight at light heavyweight instead of super middleweight, which he most likely will not, because he wants to win the undisputed titles at super middleweight more than he wants to compete at light heavyweight. Maybe after he accomplishes that goal, then he might want to move up to light heavyweight to attempt to capture the titles at light heavyweight and maybe become undisputed at light heavyweight sometime in the future as well. Who knows what Benavidez is going to do in the future, but I'm quite sure he wants to continue fighting at super middleweight and become undisputed there. And then he could discuss what he wants to do with his future after he accomplishes what he wants to accomplish, and how the light heavyweight division is looking right now. Dmitry Bivol, who's the current WBA light heavyweight champion, and then there's the unified light heavyweight champion Arthur Beterbiev. And other than those two guys, there isn't that many notable names at light heavyweight. We saw Dmitry Bivol take on two back-to-back lackluster opponents after his fight versus Zerdo Ramirez and Canelo Alvarez, who are well notable amongst that weight class and as well as well reputable names in the sport of boxing as well. And then after taking a year off, Bivol is fighting to stay active until he gets that undisputed title fight versus Arthur Beterbiev. And then the next best number one ranked contender according to all the title organization is current undefeated British fighter Joshua Buatsi. And he is gonna be in line to challenge for the light heavyweight titles and possibly a shot at becoming undisputed if and when he gets a title shot. And there's a high likely possibility of Buatsi, when he steps in there with either Bivol or Beterbiev, to have a title shot at becoming light heavyweight champion. It could be for all the titles, because as we know, Beterbiev and Bivol was scheduled to fight last month, but Beterbiev had to pull out because of injury during his training camp. And other than Buatsi, there's Dan Aziz, Gilberto Ramirez, Anthony Yarde, and these names are notable, as well as Callum Smith as well. These names are recognizable when it comes to the top of the light heavyweights. And if Benavidez goes up to a weight class like the light heavyweights where it's not really active at, other than Bivol and Beterbiev, we do not see that much major fights where it attracts a lot of crowds at light heavyweight. And Benavidez, with the reputation that he has, if he was to step up to light heavyweight and fight there full time, he would bring a lot of attention to the light heavyweight division. And as far as the super middleweights go and who is rumored to fight Canelo Alvarez next, we're hearing that Chris Eubank Jr. could be next in line to challenge for the not the light heavyweight titles, the undisputed super middleweight titles. And I don't understand why that fight with Canelo Alvarez and David Benavidez isn't already signed and sealed yet, because they are both under the same banner of working with PBC. We have Canelo Alvarez, who has his own promotion, and he signed a 2-fight deal with, or I believe a 3-fight deal with PBC after leaving the zone. And we saw his return fight back at PBC when he fought Jermell Charlo for the undisputed super middleweight titles, which didn't make a lot of sense to me because Charlo was the undisputed super welterweight champion. He had to skip 2 weight classes for that fight to happen, when he could have fought either Benavidez or Andrade. And Benavidez fought Andrade to see who's going to be next in line to challenge for the undisputed super middleweight titles versus Canelo Alvarez. And after Benavidez was able to stop Andrade, we thought Benavidez was going to get that fight versus Canelo Alvarez in May. But we had saw Munguia get in there with Canelo Alvarez instead. And we know Canelo Alvarez has bad blood with Oscar De La Hoya and Golden Boy. And there was a cross-promotional bout that happened with that fight with Saul Alvarez and Jamie Munguia, instead of an in-house fight with Saul Alvarez and David Benavidez, which would have been a much easier fight to make happen, because it would have been done exclusively with only PBC and Amazon Prime, instead of involving Golden Boy and the Zone to make that cross-promotional bout happen with Canelo and Munguia. And Chris Eubank Jr., his promotional business side of things is over there across the sea in the UK. And Chris Eubank Jr. has been a household name amongst the super middleweights for a long time. And now Chris Eubank Jr. is going to get reckoned as a top contender and actually get a title shot at not only one of the belts, but all the belts at super middleweight, if that rumor of him being Canelo's next possible opponent does become true. Now, granted, Chris Eubank Jr. in his last fight was able to knock out Liam Smith to end the trilogy rivalry that him and Smith had, and Chris Eubank Jr. got the best of that rivalry. But you look at the current top 10 super middleweight rankings according to the major sanction and title bodies, Chris Eubank Jr. is nowhere listed as the top 10 contenders amongst the super middleweights. And that's why it doesn't make sense as to why Chris Eubank Jr. would be able to get a title shot before David Benavidez, where Benavidez is recognized as a top 10 contender by all the major title sanctioning bodies as well as boxing outlets. And with that being said, promotionally speaking, politically speaking, and sport-wise speaking, for the purity sake of boxing, it makes more sense to make that fight with Benavidez against Canelo than Canelo versus Eubank. And that is all for this video. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video if y'all want. Share this content if y'all want. And hit the links in the description to show y'all support for this channel. Anything will be appreciated. And other than that, I'm out of here, y'all. Be good and peace.